So they asked the question, why was the northern kingdom not spared, whereas we in the southern kingdom, we were spared? What's the difference between the north and the south? That Yahweh would not protect the north, but would in fact protect the south. And they saw two differences. And these two differences built on some previously very popular traditions in Israel to make an entirely new religious movement arise in Israel. And these two differences were as follows. The first of the differences was that whereas, or how should I put it? I'll just say no Davidic king. The north did not have a king who was a descendant of David. And if you remember the prophecy from 2 Samuel chapter 7, Yahweh had promised that Israel would always have a descendant of David rule on the throne in Jerusalem. So it must be because all of those northern kings were not Davidite, and they were, in a sense, illegitimate kings. Yahweh is not obligated to protect illegitimate kings who are making illegitimate claims. And the second difference that they noticed was no Solomonic temple. Something I neglected to tell you when we talked about Solomon's temple was that when Solomon dedicated the temple, he too received a promise from the prophets of Yahweh. And the promise that he received was that Yahweh's presence, which is usually described in the Bible as glory, the radiant presence of Yahweh would always, always, always dwell at the very heart of the sanctuary of Solomon's temple. So, the reason Yahweh did not protect any of the northern religious shrines is because they weren't quite legitimate. Because Yahweh had only promised to be in the Solomonic temple. So they took these two observations, their presence of a Davidic king and their presence of the Solomonic temple, and they developed a theology that contemporary scholars like to call Zion, David, theology. Zion is the hill on which the Solomonic temple was built. So Zion becomes, in some sense, synonymous with the Solomonic religion of Yahweh. Yes, Jason?
But Yahweh promised that these people would always be his people, the whole land. So I don't understand what you're getting at.
This is a contrary tradition to that. Remember I told you that in the north they really focused on the covenant that Yahweh made with the Israelites in the Exodus. And that's where you get that message, that I will be your people, and or you will be my people, and I will be your God. That's where you get that message. So that's why when that didn't happen in the north, well, they despaired of their tradition. They said, well, I guess we really weren't Yahweh's people, and I guess Yahweh really wasn't our God. But in the south, they're still Yahwists. They're still worshiping Yahweh. They're still worshiping a God called Yahweh, and they're still working through out of the same tradition and the same language. But they really have a different emphasis. This is why I said this is the second most important determinative factor or shaping feature of Israel. The Exodus would be first, and this would be second. So that's a very good question. I think it brought us to an important point. Okay, Zion David theology concludes as follows. This is tremendously influential in subsequent Judean history, as we shall see. As long as we have temple on Mount Zion, where Yahweh dwells. And as long as we have a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem, we are impregnable. No foreign force can ever destroy the dynasty of David or the Temple of Solomon or the people who belong to it. That is Zion-David theology. And I mean, that sounds maybe very utilitarian or even crass, but out of this tradition comes these wonderful Zion poems, which we have in the Psalms, and we'll be going over a few of those later on in the semester. But songs of praise to the beauty and the wonders of Zion and the glories of the King. One of them that comes to mind, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the cities of our God and the mountain of his holiness. The mountain, Mount Zion, beautiful of situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion and the sides of the north, the city of the great King. A real devotion arises around this city of Zion and this wonderful monarchy, this long tradition which now has lasted about 250 years, the dynasty. You see, I've jumped a lot. Anyway, that arises out of the whole destruction of the north and the saving of the south. And one other thing I want to add, because I think there's another theological outgrowth from this period, and then we're just about done. The whole notion of Zion-David theology would be one. That's the first theological idea that arose out of the Syro-Ephraimite War and its consequences. By the way, the northern kingdom destroyed 722. So 278 years after the beginning of David's dynasty, the northern kingdom is destroyed. The second one is the relationship of religious purity to nationalism. Whenever Israel was able to break free, and this includes Judah too, I'm using Israel in the collective sense. Whenever Israel was able to break free of foreign domination, they would immediately have a religious revival and purge out the foreign influence, and there would be seasons of tremendous popular devotion and loyalty to Yahweh and conformance to the laws of Yahweh. And then at times when foreign influence moved in, at this point particularly the Assyrians, but earlier than that it was the Phoenicians, and later than that it'll be the Babylonians, and we'll see a whole host of these things. Whenever those things happen, well, their zeal for Yahweh would subside, and they'd be much more interested and open to cooperation with and even incorporation of certain foreign elements of religion. So these are the two theological ideas I want you to take out of today. The rise of Zion-David theology, and we'll be talking about that much more later on, and the issue of the relationship of religious purity to nationalism. They are religiously pure insofar as they are free of foreign domination. So the connection of the fortunes of the nation are very closely linked with their religious attitudes.